Hello, history students. I guess you may recognize uh, from the furniture behind me here that I'm in the main entry room at our co-op. Missing you guys on Fridays and hoping we could get back together, but since we can't, we'll have to let this suffice. It's going to be my only lecture to conclude our studies this year of American history. We're going to be looking at chapters 28 and 29. Hopefully you recall 26 and 27 when we're in person, because our last quiz will be 26, 27, 28, and 29. And I'll send that out in the next couple of days to your parents, where they can administer that to you. And also remember, if you want extra credit, to do the memorization of the list of the presidents. Break the ones that we looked at this semester into two groups. Either group is worth 5 points. I'll give partial credit if you give a try at that. Now, one thing about these two chapters that it's kind of fun for me is, even though some people might not realize that, I have not been alive through the first 26 and a half chapters. This has all happened before I was born, and only getting into chapter 27, as we got into the early 50s, finally now it's a time when I was actually alive. I was born in 1951, and so chapter 28 is on the 60s, and chapter 29 is on the 70s and the 80s. So I've lived through all this, and I'll reference some of my own experiences that make some of these events memorable in my own life. But chapter 28, then, we look at the 1960s, which start out, they started differently than they ended. It was a decade of upheaval, and a lot of things happened in our country that we're probably still recovering from. But it starts out with the election of John F. Kennedy, who called his approach, we think of the New Deal with FDR. Well, with Kennedy, it was the new frontier, but still offering a lot of taxpayer-funded things that he sought to use to address different groups of people in our culture, whether it be retired people, college students, the poor. And also he was really pushing an ambitious space program. In fact, he's got the whole thing going about getting us on the moon within 10 years, and we made it. In 1969, we actually put a man on the moon. Now, JFK, John F. Kennedy, had some tough things to deal with. Remember when we studied early chapter, we learned about the Cold War between the United States and between the Soviets, the USSR. It's not a hot war, it's a Cold War. It didn't actually fight except through proxies, where they would actually, as we'll see, with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, it's the communists, whether it be the Soviets or the Chinese, that are actually behind those things. So Kennedy had to deal with what was going on in Berlin. As you may recall, once again from our studies after the World War II, we had Berlin was divided, Germany divided up to east and west. The communists had the east, and then Berlin, the capital, was way out into the middle of East Germany. So that was also divided up with the different powers after the war ended, between the British and the French and us, and then the U.S. communists had their part of East Germany, East Berlin. But it didn't take very long for people in East Berlin to realize that West Berlin had a much better deal going on as far as having a job, income, decent housing, even just basic things like refrigerators, stoves, or whatever. Food at the store you can buy, clothing. It's a very drab existence. So thousands of East Berliners started fleeing to West Berlin. Many of these were the highly educated professional class in Berlin. And so the communists couldn't put up with that, so they started building a wall around West Berlin to keep people from going into it. And then there were guards there stationed around the wall that would shoot you if you tried to climb over that wall or get over that wall. So Kennedy actually went to Berlin before the wall was completed, but it was really a disappointing event for freedom when that wall continued to go forward. The other thing going on that Kennedy had to deal with is what was going on in Cuba. In 1958, Fidel Castro, a dictator, communist, had overthrown the Batista regime and taken over, and many people were being imprisoned, were being killed, many people were fleeing, and so the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of our country, decided they wanted to take some of these exiles from Cuba, equip them to fight, and send them back in. So 1,500 former Cubans, democracy-loving Cubans, agreed to go. They were supposed to have air support, never materialized. I'm not sure all the breakdown on that, but it ends up being a bad deal. 400 of those people were killed. The other 1,100 were all captured and put in prison. And so the Bay of Pigs invasion, as it's called, that's the name of the bay, Bay of Pigs, really was a real setback and an embarrassment to the United States. It gets worse in Cuba. Our spy planes noticed that the Soviets were bringing missiles into Cuba from Russia. They were such that they could handle nuclear warheads and be launched to our cities. In fact, Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And so this is very scary. And so Kennedy had some bold moves. He put warships all around Cuba, and they were intending to stop and search every Soviet ship coming to Cuba, looking for any kind of nuclear sort of equipment. The Russians were outraged. Khrushchev, the premier, was threatening and blustering, but he blinked first, and he asked then that he told Kennedy that they remove their missiles if we would agree not to invade Cuba. So the Cuban Missile Crisis ended then very quickly. Now Kennedy's regime will not last too long, because in November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. I was in my 8th grade science class at Jeton Junior High when we heard over the intercom the principal saying that our president had been shot. Within a few minutes, he got on the intercom again to tell us that our president had died. 3 o'clock, I rushed out, went down to the Paducah Sun-Democrat, where I was a newspaper boy. They had stopped the press run for the afternoon paper and were redoing the headlines in bold red print, JFK assassinated, and all the front page articles were about that. And then we had a late start on the newspaper, but people were buying them like crazy. They couldn't print enough newspapers. People were buying them and buying several, I guess. They thought they would something to hang on to in the future. But it was a terrible time, a very sad time in the life of our country. Of course, the vice president then becomes president, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, moving from the New Frontier, his program now will be called the Great Society. We wanted to have a war on poverty and eliminate poverty in our generation. And of course, a lot of the programs were very similar to, once again, the New Deal. And but he is facing a couple of things, though, that are going to limit his presidential abilities and presidential career. Those two things being civil rights and the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement, of course, civil rights are the rights everybody's guaranteed under the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But unfortunately, there have been a lot of this was all on racial lines. The North had them voluntarily, separation, the segregation. The South, it was required by law with the so-called Jim Crow laws. It was against the law to go to the same bathroom. You had your own separate bathrooms, you had separate water fountains, you had separate schools, separate hotels, separate everything. And so, and really, it was not separate but equal. It was very unequal in many cases. I saw some of that growing up in Paducah, even in the 50s. Restaurant not far from the Paducah Sun-Democrat had a back at the local restaurant within a half a block of there. The front entrance was for white people. The back entrance was for black people. And you come in, you sit in an area in the back. They're not allowed to sit up front. If you go to the movie theater, blacks in the balcony, not allowed on the main floor. So there became a grave concern for black people to have their civil rights. And a lot of this went forward after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that said no longer is it going to be good enough to have the so-called equal, separate but equal, if it's only based on race. So they felt like this violated the 14th Amendment concerning guaranteed equality. So the schools were immediately told to begin the process of integrating, and many of them did it pretty slowly. In Paducah, by the early 60s, we were starting to integrate. We had somewhere probably over around Tennessee Street and maybe 8th Street, there was a whole city block that had the Washington school district. It was all black. It was at Washington Elementary, junior high, and high school. They had their own athletic teams. Everything was pure related for blacks, and those were closed down. And then the students were then integrated into the public school system around town. And Paducah, thankfully, had a pretty smooth run with that. Thank the Lord for that. But around the country, there are a lot of protests going on, and some are advocating violence. But probably the main, most outspoken leader working for civil rights in America was Martin Luther King Jr., who was a black pastor, and he led a march on Washington in 1963. 250,000 blacks marching, and he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. You ought to look that up. I think it's actually in our book. You could find a YouTube and hear him preaching. It's very powerful. And but unfortunately, he would be murdered in 1968. He had gone to Memphis to help out with the sanitation workers' strike. Was on the balcony of a hotel and was gunned down and killed, which immediately caused a wave of violence all over the country at that point. So that's the other issue LBJ had to deal with, was the Vietnam War. Never was really a war. Congress has to declare war. It was really just a conflict. But we'd gotten involved under Kennedy. We had about 16,000 troops there that were in South Vietnam to advise them. Because just like the Korean War divided up North and South, the North being communist, the South trying to be free, that's what happened in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were communists. They're trying to conquer South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese are trying to have freedom. But a number of communist South Vietnamese were fighting against the freedom efforts and fighting against the South Vietnamese army. They were called the Viet Cong. So it was a tough road to hoe. When LBJ became president, he felt like we need to do more. So he told Congress that there had been 2 American destroyers that had been attacked in international waters off the coast of Vietnam. Congress came up with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and that gave him permission to go forward, including armed forces against the North Vietnamese. Wasn't a declaration of war, but gave him broad powers. And by 1965, we have over 1 million young men who were in Vietnam, mostly had been drafted on Vietnamese soil. So it was a war that increasingly was politicized. It was, of course, many young men were being drafted, and many were coming back missing arms and legs, and many died. Over 58,000 young men, mostly young men, died in the Vietnam War. They weren't welcome back at all when they came back because the war had become so unpopular. The media, this is the first real time when the media was such that it was able to bring these images of body bags and bodies and put that on the screen every night for people watching the news around dinner time. And so it became a very unpopular war. There began to be a lot of demonstrations, anti-war marches. At Kent State University in 1970, the National Guard was was put there to disperse the crowd of students that were protesting. And I don't know how it exactly happened, but somebody panicked, and at the end of the struggle, their 4 students had been killed by the soldiers. Around the same time, Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, led to 2 more deaths, similar circumstances. So Nixon, in the meanwhile, had been elected, and he is saying we're going to get out of the war, but we're going to do it in such a way that victory will have honor, and we'll keep our head up. And so that was his plan, was to pull a lot of the people out and just use bombing, and that began to go forward. But in the meanwhile, Nixon is having other problems. He there was a break-in of the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they were caught. Turns out these 5 men were working for the committee to get Nixon reelected in the 1972 election. So through a long, drawn-out process of investigation, a number of Nixon's top leaders, some of you are familiar with Chuck Colson, Charles Colson, who was the founder of Prison Fellowship and the Colson Worldview Center. He's now with the Lord, but it was him going to prison that led to him coming to Christ and having an incredible ministry to prisons around the world. But anyway, so all these people are going to prison. Nixon himself finally is found to be guilty enough for the Congress to impeach him. In fact, the House impeached him. The Senate is having a trial. It becomes evident to Nixon that he's going to be found guilty and removed from office. And so he resigned. That never happened before in American history. A president resigned from the presidency. So he did that so he would not be impeached. And so that is the unfortunate ending to the career of Richard M. Nixon, which, as I mentioned earlier, a number of other things happened here around the same time. We have the landing of man on the moon. We have the women's movement trying to pass an equal rights amendment, which turned out to be a very bad idea. We have a lot going on. We have the court of these presidents like Nixon tried to bring in good people who believed in the Constitution, and we end up having Roe versus Wade because we didn't have a lot of good people who believed in the Constitution. In 1973, all the anti-abortion laws of all 50 states were stricken down by that decision in 1973. That decision still stands. That's why we've had all these children, unborn babies, killed since then. So this pretty much brings us to the end of chapter 28. And now let me move us over to chapter 29 then, looking at the 70s and 80s, where we have, after Nixon resigns, the vice president, Gerald Ford, is inaugurated as our next president. He had actually not been elected to the vice presidency. He replaced someone else that had been Nixon's original vice president. And just 1 month in, he ignited a firestorm because he decided to pardon Richard Nixon. Many people felt like that, even his defenders and fellow Republicans were unhappy. They felt like it's not fair for all these other men are in prison serving time, and Nixon just going free. So Ford pardoned him for any possible crime he may have committed through the whole Watergate thing. Any rate, that really crippled Ford's ability to really lead the country, and certainly sealed his doom for getting elected in the next presidential election, which goes to a Georgia peanut farmer by the name of James Earl Carter. He preferred to be called Jimmy. He wanted to kind of de-glamorize the office of presidency. He just wanted to be a kind of a common man. Wore a sweater, I believe, and oftentimes in his public presentations on television. And Okay, just want to make sure I haven't lost my signal there.
Very good.
And so he was a one-termer and had a lot of problems. Runaway inflation, are printing way too much money, and so everything's costing more, and wages weren't keeping up with expenses. There was a gas crisis, and so he had a lot of things going on that I lived through that I still remember standing in line, sitting in line actually for hours trying to get gas, and also the crisis on mortgage, interest rates on mortgages, which is up to 20%. So I think that his future was going to be very short in the presidency for those, if not other reasons. So he had a formidable foe in 1980, a former actor, former governor of California, the name of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came on, would be a two-termer, and he was a conservative, and fiscally and in for social issues as well. And his view was we need to lower the tax rate. We need to get rid of all these regulations that we impose on business people, and let them go and run and let their business go. And he was mocked and scorned. It was called voodoo economics, or Reaganomics. But the truth is, it worked, and the economy just sort of took off, under Reagan's leadership. And then he also began to try to once again get good people on the Supreme Court. He appointed the first ever female Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, which and while he did place some good people on the court, and they stood up for a lot of things, none of them were willing to take on the Roe v. Wade problem, which is what a lot of people were wanting to happen. Now, on the foreign policy area, Reagan believed in peace through strength. Many people thought we ought to scale back our military and our armaments, and so the Russians would know we weren't a threat to them. And he just felt like that was the very wrong idea. Once again, we're still in a Cold War, and so the Russians are spending a lot of their money on increasing their atomic nuclear weapons. And so Reagan had a proposal to come up with what we called an SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which would actually knock down nuclear missiles as they're flying in. We can knock them down. Well, his detractors called it Star Wars. But the truth is, this really brought Russia to the bargaining table under Mikhail Gorbachev and began to really eliminate a lot of the atomic threat here. And so Reagan battled communism wherever it could be found around the world. He got involved when in Nicaragua here in our own hemisphere, we have the communists were involved. They're called the Sandinistas, and so there were other a group in Nicaragua called the Contras that were fighting for freedom. So Reagan began to funnel aid to the Contras to try to help them keep democracy going on there in Nicaragua. Now, the next president after Reagan then was Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, not George W. Bush, George H.W., elected in 1988, and he presided over the next major war our country was involved in was the Persian Gulf War. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait in 1990. And so under the UN's orders, which came against Hussein, we got going, and we had about a 5-week, very quick bombing and victory against Saddam Hussein. Of course, that won't be the end of that story. And so, but this is the end almost of chapter 28. I just want to mention the Los Angeles riots. Remember, we'd had these riots back in the 60s. But now we have another round of riots. In fact, in Los Angeles in 1992, we have 53 people died, over $1 billion of property damage after a man named Rodney King, who had been driving drunk. He was driving at 115 miles an hour. Big guy, 6'4", 240 pounds. They tried to subdue him. He's fighting with them, but it turns out they overdid it, and they had billy clubs and flashlights that they were using, and this was all on videotape, and that ended up being used to later on have the city pay the man about $4 million. But that's what led, though, was considered to be police malpractice, and that's why we have this sudden eruption that led in 53 people being killed and $1 billion worth of damage in America's second largest city. So, that's the world we live in, it seems like, doesn't it? One riot, one war, one this, one that, after another. Aren't we glad that Jesus Christ is the Lord of it all? One day He's coming back, and the Prince of Peace will actually bring about, finally, world peace. And we won't have this stuff anymore as we think about the new heavens and the new earth. Let me pray for you. Lord, I thank you for these students. I pray that you'd give them a good summer, help them finish up their school year with joy, and just pray continue to protect each of the students and their families and their parents, grandparents, from all that's going around these days with the pandemic. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.